14th of July. It was light, and I woke up and there was the policeman standing beside the bed.
When she was arrested, she was put in the small cell, the woman's cell. They had a sink and a commode.
Virginia, 1924. The new Virginia law to preserve racial integrity is in action. Marriage with opposite races would lead to a sentence in prison. Virginia, 1958. Many black women and men all over the country were suffering separation from their loved ones in 24 different states just for their race. A young couple named Mildred and Richard Loving fell in love. The only problem? Richard was white and Mildred was of African and Native American descent, which meant they couldn't get married in Virginia. That didn't stop them. The couple went up to Washington, D.C. and legally married there on June 2nd, 1958. They later moved back into Virginia to start their home and family. They were a happy family until the police received an anonymous tip about their interracial marriage. On July 14, 1967, the police broke into their home, arresting them. Richard Loving was set in jail for one night, and while pregnant, Mildred was sentenced in jail for 1 year. Almost 1 month after Mildred was locked up, the couple went to court and pleaded guilty. Their sentence was later suspended as long as they leave the state of Virginia and not return together for 25 years.
But I didn't realize how bad it was until we got married. We were under $1,000 bond. And his sister got a bonding company to get him out. And they told the bonding company if they tried to get me out that they would put him back in jail.
The 1960s was the time of many protests for civil rights. In this time, the Vietnam War was at its peak, and John F. Kennedy was elected president. It was a time of struggle for social justice. People began protesting for their future, including voting rights, the Civil Rights Act, the first sit-in protests, and anti-nuclear protests. It was also a time when many states were enforcing laws of discrimination, and groups like the KKK were emerging and gaining influence. This was a time of triumph and tragedy. Mildred and Richard Loving lived out by the country in Central Point, Virginia. Mildred lived her whole life on a farm and loved it very much. So when she was forced to move out of Virginia and into Washington, D.C., she wasn't able to adapt to the new life. Richard and Mildred Loving decided to sneak back into Virginia and stay there in secret.
And I'll be close to my mother and he'll be close to his family.
You feel close to your families, are you?
Yeah, we're very close. And that's what we will do, if we win. If we don't win, then we have to leave again. I dread to even think about it.
Richard lived down in the community where most of the Indians lived. I don't know if Mildred had any Indian in her or not. Possibly could have. And if they got romantically involved or whatever, they kept it to themselves.
Mildred soon became tired of having to live in secret and wrote out to Robert Kennedy for help, since they couldn't afford an attorney. Robert Kennedy was the Attorney General of the United States. Robert Kennedy responded, telling them to contact the ACLU, American Civil Liberties Union, which was a non-profit organization that was made to defend and preserve the individual rights and liberties guaranteed to every person in this country. The ACLU responded and told them to contact two attorneys they had in mind, Bernard Cohen and Philip Hirschgoff.
I looked at it as a unbelievable challenge for a lawyer 1 or 2 years out of law school to be getting involved in what was sure to be a major civil rights case.
When Mr. and Mrs. Loving were having their problems, they wrote to the Attorney General of the United States, who was then Robert Kennedy, and asked if the civil rights bills that were being discussed in Congress at that time, let's say, I guess it was 1963, would give them any relief from their problem.
Mildred and Richard Loving went to the Virginia court with their attorneys, but the court did not want to uplift their law, which brought the case up to the Supreme Court. Despite being told they would be banned from Virginia, they still had hope.
Then he's going to do it, and when they want to come back to Virginia for any reason, they're going to come back together. They'll just take that chance. They may be low class, as he would say, but they had determination and the will to come back and do what they need to do to be with their family.
He just wanted me to go see Judge Basile and convince Judge Basile to let them come back into Virginia. When I told him I didn't think it was going to work that way and that I thought this case was likely to go to the Supreme Court of the United States, his jaw about dropped, and he couldn't accept what I was saying to him. He just said, "Can't you just go see Judge Basile and tell him we don't want to harm anybody, we just want to live in peace in Virginia?"
He just said, "You crossed the line with me, and I'm an American, I have a right to be free, I have a right to choose a wife and live with the woman I love, and you got no right to tell me no, period." A good possibility you can never reach the constitutional issues because they pled guilty and they waived those issues.
Judge Basile finally issued an order denying my motion to vacate the judgment and set aside the sentence.
Judge Basile, in his opinion, had the following thing to say: Almighty God created the races white, black, yellow, Malay, and red, and he placed them on separate continents. And but for the interference with his arrangements, there would be no cause for such marriages. The fact that he separated the races shows that he did not intend the races to mix.
The fight to the Supreme Court case lasted almost 5 years, and many testimonies were brought forward. After many weeks of waiting for a response, the Chief Justice Earl Warren declared, "Under our Constitution, the freedom to marry or not marry a person of another race resides with the individual and cannot be infringed by the state." After his statement, the court unanimously shared their verdict and uplifted the law of interracial marriages through the country.
The Supreme Court held today that marriages of whites and Negroes are legal and that no state may stop them. The decision was unanimous, and Chief Justice Warren wrote it. The case was brought by a white man from Virginia, a construction worker, and his wife, who is part Negro and part Indian. At issue was an anti-miscegenation law in Virginia. At one time, 41 states forbade interracial marriage. In more recent years, all but 16 have repealed these laws. Now, they will all have to go.
After the Loving v. Virginia case, it began to inspire people to fight for their rights, and it sparked the case for gay rights. Now, 1 in 12 marriages is made up of people of different races. People began accepting interracial marriages, and communities became integrated.
See that it's become a lot more acceptable in American society over the decades.
17 years ago, we got married in the state of Virginia. Had it not been for the case of Loving versus Virginia, we'd not been able to get married there or in 19 states.
As Kim Keenan once said, along with other key cases, it brought an end to a separate and unequal legally sanctioned way of life in America.
Maybe we'll lose the small battles and win the big war.
As a result of the tragic Virginia law to preserve racial integrity and ban interracial marriages, the Lovings brought triumph to many African American marriages around the world that could now legally wed, all because they stayed loving through tragedy.